present today. We would like to say that the South and Valley and Galena groundwater districts have both participated in a lot of research and looking for data and interesting information. Since 2015, we've learned a lot about our valley as well as our groundwater aquifer in order to create a comprehensive groundwater management plan that will work for a long time in the future. With that in mind, we would like to start our presentation, and Dave will start out. Him and Eric will show some information together, and then each of them has some presentation to go separately. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Christy. South Valley has produced a little report that we will share with you. You can put it on the website. We're happy to have you make that available. It goes through a little history of changes in irrigation practices on the triangle. And those changes, I think, are part of the reason for some of the other changes we're seeing in the system. I want to start today. We're going to talk about, first note, we've got a long-term gauge there with a good gauge record. Then there's Silver Creek at Sportsman's Access down near Peekaboo. That's a shorter term gauge, but one that we rely on. Kind of in between, there's an observation well. Nothing particularly magical about this well, except it has a long enough record that we can compare it to the flows at Silver Creek. And it suffers the same problems as Ed was describing. Early on, there were usually 3 measurements a year. You don't know if that was the high point or the low point or somewhere in between. And then on the Wood River discharge side, there used to be a gauge at what USGS called near Bellevue. In 1997, for whatever reason, USGS moved that gauge to Stanton Crossing and left out Willow Creek. Has been for several years an Idaho power gauge on Willow Creek. I don't know if that gauge is still operating or not. I noticed the data stopped in 2020. This is a record of the gauge at Haley, 1916 to the present, a little over 100 years. And we see over the years there has been perhaps a little increase in average annual discharge. We can also see the good years, the bad years, some really bad years more recently. We hear people say, gosh, I wish it were like it were in the 70s. Well, yeah, 70s were good for a lot of things, except for 77. And I think the trend line is what everybody uses. I think Eric's done a more sophisticated look at the discharge there. So I'll let him take it next.
Thanks, Dave. So this is Eric Powell. I think before we get into too much of evaluating of all the statistical numbers, I think it's good to step back and discuss a little bit about what statistics are and what we're referring to. So statistics is a science of collecting and analyzing data. The challenge is that most statistical methods ideally use independent data, and river flow is not independent. And so the USGS recommends for any trend analysis using river flow data that you use a Mann-Kendall analysis. Most of the trend lines that we see in plots are generated by least squares, which gives us a good estimate, but Mann-Kendall is the preferred method for using any sort of trend analysis. And so there's 2 main statistical results from Mann-Kendall that we're going to discuss. And the first one's the Mann-Kendall tau value, which is basically the slope of the line. And that is a term that's you can use the input data. In this case, it's the average CFS per month. And so tau value then is the trend, the slope, and the magnitude of that trend line in CFS per month per year over the period of record. And so, and then the other term that we're going to talk about is the p-value. And that is a statistical confidence in the value that was obtained, basically your tau value. So anytime you do a statistics, there's two main results, and I apologize for going back to stats 101, so forgive me. But I think it's important that we understand is one is the first option, or the first hypothesis, is called the null hypothesis. In our case, that means that there is no statistical trend in the data. And then the other option is that you either reject the null hypothesis, means that there is trend in the data, or you failed to reject the null hypothesis, means that you were unable to determine if there was trend in the data or not. And so the p-value gives you some estimate of the confidence of that. And statistically, usually a value of 0.05 as a p-value or less means that you reject the null hypothesis and that there's trend in the data. If you fail to reject the null hypothesis, it doesn't mean that there's not trend in the data. It just the data doesn't support enough statistically to show that. So with that lengthy introduction to statistics, this is the same data that Dave just showed of the period of record at the gauge at Haley from 1915 through 2020. And every month has a positive trend in the data, except July that has a slight negative, but virtually zero. But the p-value, or the confidence in that statistical trend, is we failed to reject the null hypothesis for every month except March. And so we have a p-value in March that's less than 0.05, which is statistically then significant. And so that helps us identify to say the runoff over the period of record is happening more or earlier in the year. And so the runoff is occurring earlier just based on the statistics at the gauge at Haley. So with that, Dave, I think we're back to you.
Okay. If we look at the period then from 1970 to present, we see, again, a least squares analysis shows there has been a decline over time. We get out of the good years in the 70s, part of the 60s. We had a bad series of events, late 80s, early 90s, and then 2000 through 2004. 2006 was a decent year, and then so good years until 2017. So here the trend line shows there has been a decline over that period. And if you look at the individual years and how they shape up, there's no surprise. And one of the questions or comments we've heard is, well, that decline is probably largely due to groundwater pumping. And that's not the case. Groundwater pumping is certainly measurable. At the Haley gauge, it's over 4,000 acre feet a year on average. But when compared to the whole runoff of the basin, it's really small. And you can see the two trend lines there. The upper one is with the groundwater depletion added back in, and the lower one is just the data that you saw on the previous slide. Eric?
Thanks, Dave. So this is just looking at, again, the Mann-Kendall analysis at the flows per month from the period of 1960 through 2020. So again, we have this situation that we've recognized throughout the state of high flows or high runoffs during the 60s and 70s, and then a declining trend to today. The tau value, or the slope of these lines, is significantly different than we saw from the whole period of record from 1915 through 2020. So the last 60 years, we have seen this declining trend, with the exception of the 2 months in March and April. We have positive, again, suggesting that we're having earlier runoffs that are occurring at the Haley gauge. The only month of statistical significance, or it's not even, it's pretty close, but not quite statistically significant, is the month of September, which has a declining trend of 0.17 CFS per month per year, average CFS per month per year. And so we're going to use this data with comparison then to stand crossing here in a bit. But Dave, back to you.
Okay, this is the gauge at near Bellevue. Again, it's 1916 to the present, and we synthesized the last few years by using the Stanton Crossing and the Willow Creek data. 1916 matches the Haley gauge, and there were some missing data early on in this record, so synthesized that from the Haley gauge. It shows a similar trend to the Big Wood at Haley, a slight increase over the period of record. And again, you can see the sequence in the 60s and 70s was pretty good. 61 was bad, 77. But then we get into the period late 80s, early 90s, where there were a number of bad years. 97 was good, then some more bad years, early 2000s. 2006 was a good year. So more recently, we've had a series of bad years, but yet the overall trend still shows a slight increase over the period of record.
So this is again looking at just the Mann-Kendall statistical results. This is not the full period of record for the near Bellevue gauge or the Stanton Crossing gauge. This is a subset of just looking at from 1960 through 2020. And so this is looking at, if we were going back to Dave's chart, from the middle of that chart towards present day, we are seeing a steady decline. That trend line is negative during the later part of the summer into the winter. And again, we have some positive values early in the spring. But the only statistical significant results are occurring in August and September, and then again in December and January. So we are starting to see some statistically significant declines in that data over the last 60 years. And again, we're going to come back and look at those values as they compare to Haley in a minute. So, Dave?
Okay. This is a chart of the maximum fill of Magic Reservoir each year. Again, you see the period in the 50s, 60s, 70s. There were good water years generally. Magic was able to fill or nearly fill in most years. In the early 20s, not so good. And more recently, we've had not such a good opportunity to fill Magic. And then if we overlay the near Bellevue gauge and the maximum fill in Magic, we can see the good water years, Magic fills regularly. During the not so good years, Magic did not fill. And 1916 was when Magic was raised, so that's when we started the analysis here. A slight upward trend, like we talked about before at Bellevue, a slight downward trend for the maximum fill of magic. And then if we add in Little Camas, I didn't try to extend the record like Ed has. This is the first record at the Little Camas gauge, and we see likewise a declining trend from the contribution of Little Camas to the fill of magic. And this is the 1970 period for the near Haley gauge, the upper line, and the near Bellevue gauge. Both show slight declines over that period. The Haley gauge, a little steeper decline than the near Bellevue gauge, but year in, year out, they follow each other very, very closely.
So this is a chart comparing the USGS gauge at Haley versus the USGS gauge near Bellevue or at Stand Crossing over the period from 1960 to 2020. And if we make a general assumption that the USGS gauge at Haley has minimal impact from groundwater pumping, and we compare or subtract the two tau values between those two gauges, we can get an estimate of what the approximate impact, we can attribute that somewhat to groundwater pumping. And so the change in tau, or the change in slope impact per year over that period of record is shown here in that change, or the delta tau. If we multiply that change in tau per month over the period of record, we can get an estimate of CFS impact over that period of record, and then an approximate volume statistically on the change in flow, or those trends based on statistics. And so you boil that down, and over the course of that period of record, at the end in 2020, there's an impact of just under 2,000 acre feet based on the statistics of the flows at Haley and at Stand Crossing. Dave?
Okay. We're going to switch and start talking about Silver Creek for a little bit. This is a comparison of, again, the Bigwood River at Haley and Silver Creek at Sportsman's Access Gauge. They both show declines. The Silver Creek has a little higher rate of decline than the Bigwood near Haley. And I realize there's no surface connection between the Bigwood at Haley and Silver Creek, but we know, for example, from 2017, Silver Creek responds to precip and snowmelt runoff. And we don't have a gauge that tells us about precip and runoff that's readily accessible. So we use the Bigwood at Haley as a substitute. And some of the impact over the period of time for Silver Creek declines appears to be related to climatic changes, just like the Bigwood at Haley. But the decline is steeper, so there's likely to be some other influence on Silver Creek discharge. This is another comparison of Silver Creek discharge at Sportsman versus diversions into the D45 canal. D45 irrigates a good part of the Bellevue Triangle. We've seen a decline in those diversions over time, and it's a little less than the decline in Silver Creek, but similar. And we know, or we believe, part of the decline in Silver Creek is due to climatic changes, and we think part of the decline is due to reduced diversions in the D45 as well. Since 1991, the rate of decline of Silver Creek has decreased. It's doing better. It's still not recovered. It's still not stable, but it has improved since 1991.
So these are the statistical results of looking at the flows on Silver Creek Sportsman's Axis. And I hope you can see the radical difference on Silver Creek versus the Big Wood. There is a statistically significant decrease for every month of the year, with the exception of May and June, but it still is showing a negative trend through the whole period of record. Obviously, we wish, just like Ed mentioned earlier, we wish we had more data, and we wish that this Silver Creek gauge extended much farther in the past, and would help us give a much better picture about how Silver Creek performs. But there's definitely a statistically significant decrease that's occurring in Silver Creek.
This is a correlation of groundwater levels in the well. We pointed out it's on the map when we first started, and the discharge of Silver Creek. This is not a time series. This acts as its depth to water. When the depth to water is shallower, Silver Creek discharge is more. When depth to water is greater, Silver Creek discharge is less. So this represents data from the period of record, but I want to point out this is not a time series. This is a relationship to discharge based on groundwater levels over the period of record from 1975 to the present. If we look at that same relationship from 1991 to the present, it still holds. So still Silver Creek is responding to groundwater levels, at least in the water table aquifer. This is the same kind of correlation with the diversions into the District 45 canal. So this is diversions in thousands of acre feet by the District 45 canal, and again, discharge of Silver Creek. There's still a relationship here. It's not as strong as with groundwater, but based on this relationship, it supports our proposal that restoring diversions in the District 45 canal and getting that water onto the triangle, we can recover at least a portion of the Silver Creek discharge that we believe is the result of reduced diversions in the District 45 canal. This is a comparison of Silver Creek at Sportsman's to gauge 10. And gauge 10 is on the Littlewood River at Richfield. And most of the water in the Littlewood at Richfield is basically Silver Creek water. We know there are diversions between Sportsman's and gauge 10, so we expect gauge 10 to have less discharge. But what we didn't really expect was the rate of decline at gauge 10 to be more rapid than the rate of decline in Silver Creek. So something else is happening, we believe, that is reducing the amount of water available at gauge 10. Perhaps it's this at Highway 93, but something is happening between those two gauges that that needs to be investigated. Eric, I'll run slides for you.
All right, thanks, Dave. So I think it's always important to make sure we define things and to make sure that we all understand what terms we're using. I appreciate Tim starting out with some definitions. And so I just want to point out that the Bigwood Littlewood Water Users Association described quasi-injury last meeting, and that's not a term that's defined or recognized by the state of Idaho as far as I'm aware. I put in some other definitions. First of all, junior priority is a water right priority date later in time than the priority date of other water rights being considered. And then material injury is the hindrance to or impact upon the exercise of a water right caused by the use of water by another person as determined in accordance with Idaho law, set forth in Rule 42. Just to create some groundwork, some foundation there. All right, next. So we saw this graph from the Bigwood Littlewood Water Users Association. This is groundwater development that was shown in blue. As Eric Miller discussed, he definitely mentioned that this was not a quantity. It was just the number of rights granted based on his evaluation. And so we looked at the use volume and use flow rate as used by the Department of Water Resources in the development of the Wood River groundwater model. And it definitely illustrates the development in the groundwater development in the valley really occurred much earlier than the line in blue represents. And so the majority of groundwater development occurred between the 1950s when it was about 10% to 1975 when it was about 80%. So 75% of the development of groundwater occurred in those 25 years. Similar to what Ed was discussing about how groundwater development occurred in the Camas Prairie. But this was a little bit earlier than that. So the majority of those rights were developed there from the 1950s to 1975. All right, next. So this is an interesting graph. So this is showing priority date of a water right on the x-axis. From 1880, and then we just cut it off in 1910. But then we evaluated the number of days that water rights were in priority, and the water master for Water District 37 divides priority date cuts of surface rights into 3 main sections. So all surface water rights on the Bigwood River above Magic have 1 priority date cut. All the Bigwood River surface rights below Magic have 1 priority cut. And then all the surface rights in the Silver Creek / Littlewood have a different priority cut. And what we found is that a water right a surface water right on the Bigwood River above Magic with, say, an 1890 priority date was cut earlier than a similar priority date surface water right on the Bigwood River below Magic or on Silver Creek / Littlewood. Now, the one exception to that is the Bigwood River right with an 1882 priority date that's shown in orange that was cut on average earlier. Now, this period of record only extends from 1997 through 2018. And that's just looking at the Water Master delivery books, or so-called the black books. So if we go to the next slide, Dave, just resolving that data down into pure numbers, that the Bigwood River surface rights below Magic, looking at all priority dates, were on for just under 14 more days than the surface rights above Magic. And then if we look just at the priority dates that were earlier than 1900, then on average, those rights were on for 16 more days than the surface water rights above Magic. And then if we look at similar priority cuts for Silver Creek compared to the Bigwood River above Magic, in both situations, all the prior dates or prior dates before 1900, they were on for just 11 days more. And so We can then go to the next slide, Dave. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about efficiency. The Bigwood Littlewood Water Users Association talked about that they assumed a 90% efficiency for all groundwater diversions. And so again, just to create some definitions, the National Engineering Handbook, the USDA, describes irrigation efficiency as a ratio of the average depth of irrigation water that is beneficially used to the average depth of irrigation water applied, expressed as a percentage. And so just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So I've raised concerns about using a blanket number across the entire valley before, because I think that that's a huge variable that is just blanketly applied. And so we looked at 6 different areas. These were kind of just randomly picked just to illustrate different efficiencies given different applications. And so there are 3 examples in the upper valley. So the first 3, water right 37-8575A is a snowmaking right. Water use in the Valley Club Owners Association, which is a large residential area in between Haley and Ketchum. And then the Sun Valley Water and Sewer Distribution, those are all up in the main part of the valley between Haley and Ketchum. The lower 3, or the next 3, were water rights that were picked pretty much at random, individual use groundwater rights that are not supplemental. Those first 2, water right 37-22328 and then 37-8011A, are both primary groundwater rights. And then large scale agricultural use. And so I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly. And so the snowmaking right, obviously, water is diverted during the non-irrigation season. It's applied to the mountainside. There is some loss from sublimation, from water, from snow turning in directly to water vapor. And some literature suggests that that's somewhere between 18 and 25%. And so that's just based on literature research. The Valley Club Owners Association, we have some record of diversions from their facility directly, which in 2018 was 267 acre feet. Excuse me. And there's about 227 acres within their place of use. So if we look at approximate return from in-house use, because this is a domestic, they use that water for domestic use as well. So we made an assumption just over 20% of that was used for in-house use based on the Sun Valley Water and Sewer use. And then we used the metric ET data and the crop irrigation requirement of what was needed to effectively grow the crops from metric ET within that place of use. And we came up with 76%. Sun Valley Water and Sewer was very similar. We have diversion data and then what was returned through the treatment plant, and then what was used then for irrigation purposes. We came with the same number of 76%, and we actually used that same irrigation efficiency number as Valley Club Owners Association within the Sun Valley Water and Sewer, just because there was a lot of ground that was not applied with irrigation water within that place of use. And then looking at irrigation efficiency within the triangle itself, the 2 individual uses were much lower in efficiency than we ever anticipated. The diversion volumes were 9.6 acre feet versus 10.28. The crop irrigation requirement was 3.4 and then 2.45, which gave us an efficiency on those two properties of 35% and 23%. And then the last one was a very highly controlled irrigation practice. And this is Silver Springs Ranch, right by Baseline Road. The map itself is actually turned, and so north is actually pointing to the left, or sorry, the right in this case, excuse me. So Baseline Road is running from the bottom of the map to the top. But we looked at 2 full pivots, 1 wiper, and then some hand lines. And there are, they've spent significant amount of time, effort, and money to monitor their water use on the Silver Springs Ranch. And in those locations, this was actually a combination of surface water and groundwater throughout the season. This wasn't just groundwater diversions. But the meters on each one of those pivots and wheel lines was 772 acre feet. The metric data resulted in 648 acre feet, which in this case was an irrigation efficiency of 84%. All right, so if we go to the next slide, Dave. So we can boil that down to just the overall concern of using a blanket 90% number for all diversions in the valley grossly overestimates the amount of consumption that's occurring with some refined, just looking at those 6 different locations. And so it raises a lot of concerns just about that blanket approach. All right, next slide, Dave. So the final slide that I have is the question was raised: if we were to divert 20,000 acre feet out of the Bigwood River for recharge into the District 45 or some other locations, would that statistically impact the flows at the Bigwood River at Stand Crossing? And so we've talked about these statistics before. And so I did a simulation with the same data set at the Bigwood River at Stand Crossing from 1960 through 2020, and then diverted or reduced flow in the months of April, May, and June from the years 2000 through 2020 to simulate, would we see a significant statistical downward trend by diverting that water for recharge? And the results are no, we don't see a statistically significant trend from doing that simulation with diverting water for recharge. And I believe that's all I have, Dave. So I think that's back to you.
Thank you, Eric. Just a few comments to wrap up here. You know, Eric Miller presented these numbers at the last meeting of the committee. Some of us have seen these numbers before. Eric Powell just describes some of the differences in analysis that we believe are causing some numbers in these tables that we simply disagree with. So we would like the opportunity at some point to sit down, roll up our sleeves, and see if we can come to some agreement. We think there's differences of opinion about how all of these numbers should be generated. I think it's something we can work through, but it will take some time. Eric Miller's conclusions, he talks about material injury. We're talking about a groundwater management plan. Section 42-233B doesn't mention material injury, so I'm not sure if it's going to be relevant. And there has not been any material injury analysis to date. The 50,000 acre feet, 36,000 acre feet, as I said, we need to talk about those. Those are numbers that we don't agree with. Eric already talked about quasi-injury. So hopefully we can sit down and find some kind of resolution. Craig Tesh with the Department of Water Resources at the 2020 Water Users Annual Conference presented groundwater conditions throughout Idaho. This is what he presented for the Bigwood. Across Idaho, these are some of the better groundwater trends. They're both showing a slight decline, but compared to many other places in the state, they're really pretty good. And then Alan Wiley's September 2019 summary of groundwater conditions. Alan did a man-Kendall analysis similar to what Eric Powell was talking about. Here, all of the values were, the TAW values were positive. 0.11 in October, 0.041 in November, 0.182 in April. The p-value was only significant in April. So there was a statistically significant improvement in groundwater levels in April. There was what looked like a positive trend, but not statistically significant in October and November. And with that, I think Pat McMahon is up.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks everybody for sitting through our presentation. There's a tremendous amount of material here, and I encourage you to download or view the stuff online and get into it. It's fascinating, some of the topics that they go on. So with this, I guess we were ready to say that we want to get together. We want to put this groundwater management plan together, and we have tons of data, and we're willing to share that with you. And we just like you, the callers, to respond to an information request from August 6th of last year. And let me get 1 second here. Yeah, we look forward to sitting down and getting this worked out. And I'll close on that.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Any questions or maybe